Okay, got it. And it's a pleasure to virtually meet all of you and have you here. Thank you for attending this talk and for being here. So I figured I would get straight into it and start screen sharing. And so I'll kind of present sort of an overview of my thinking at this moment in my life and kind of move through a few recent works and older works in order to do that, and then kind of land at a place where we can sort of open up for questions that hopefully we'll have plenty of time for that. But I wrote a text to start with, partly because I think this whole time that we've just lived through has opened up a lot of space for introspection and for questioning, and it's made me value a lot of the thinking that led me to make the work that I'm making now, and kind of has been a moment of reviewing and kind of revisiting what were some of these initial ideas that kind of determined how I now think as an artist and operate in the world. And why specifically am I a sculptor? And I thought this would be a good opportunity to share some of those ideas with you. So I'll read a little bit and then I'll go into a little bit less of a reading kind of vibe. This is Dürer's image Melancholia. So I call myself a sculptor and not an artist, because despite the fact that I work also in video and through drawings and sometimes photography. I think through three-dimensional objects. I believe in the importance of making three-dimensional objects and installations that take up space in the room with us as artworks. I enter the world of sculpture as a medium that has already, at this historical moment, become modern, autonomous, free from the burden of having to engage in the representation of the real, and free to engage in its own medium-specific conversation. Sculpture can now be objects that analyze sculpture's own history, engage in medium-specific negotiations of form, mass, inside and outside, scale and volume, movement, balance, surface, production processes, all without pointing outside of itself. Sculpture as sculpture about sculpture. I value this freedom. I also realize that I'm producing objects at a time in which the world has become burdened to the point of extinction by the social and economic relations that our European ancestors established with objects, other humans, and also with nature. We are living the consequences of a 400-year project, or longer, according to some, begun by conceptually positioning the human being outside of nature. I think, therefore I am. The Enlightenment freed our minds from religion and superstition, establishing an objective scientific human perspective with nature and our animal bodies on the other side of an imaginary line. Whether you were colonized into this project or dragged into it by your desire to survive or wholeheartedly embrace it, the globalization of these ideas has meant that most people on this planet now have been impacted by this project in some way or another. And this is some industrialization images and trash outside New York. So Francis Bacon, not the painter, but the founder of what some of us think of as a scientific revolution, might have put it, nature awaited human reason's penetration of her virgin forests and the firm-handed prying open of her material secrets. Nature, which was cast as female, and the human intellect cast as male, danced us into the Industrial Revolution in England and to the development of capitalism as a consequence of the increasing division between physical labor and the intellectual managerial logic needed to run a competitive industry producing material commodities. With capitalism and the division of labor, the human body and therefore life energy and the human's capacity as an animal for physical labor was now firmly placed on the other side of the line. A part of nature, another God-given natural resource awaiting domination and exploitation. So how do we, as both intellectuals and producers of objects, we make sculptures, we make artworks, how do we have it in us still to make things? I mean this as a really honest question. How do you wake up in the morning and look at the world outside and think, this world needs more stuff? and I'm gonna make more stuff for it. I live in New York, and I'll go back to that image. And on Wednesdays, which is normally the trash day in my neighborhood, the streets are littered with perfectly useful, unbroken pieces of furniture, tables, chairs, electronics, printers, toasters, as well as very often paintings and small decorative pieces that we can call sculpture, accompanied by little handwritten signs that say, "Free, still works, please take." How do we make more crap? Artists have negotiated this by dematerializing their practices. So for example, here's Hans Hacke's MoMA pole from 1970, which very much I feel illustrates a part of that history. And making artworks that were research, presented as posters, paper, a site-specific intervention, for example. This is an amazing piece by Michael Asher, where he took a statue of George Washington that used to be outside, or I think it might still be, outside of the Chicago Institute of Art. I don't know if anyone here knows if it's still there, and placed it inside, exhibiting it with other artifacts from the same historical period. So kind of, inserting this monument into a historic specificity as something that perhaps is perceived as more outdated and emblematic of a specific time, as opposed to when it's outside in the building and it still stands as a historical monument. The idea is that these artworks of this nature were proposing was that sculpture and art in general had evolved into this other conceptual territory. All art that depicted human form or engaged in representation at this time in history became regressive, a nostalgic exercise and an attempt to return to a simpler times, perhaps, when artists weren't aware of themselves as making and their artworks as part of a larger global project of making objects for human consumption. In our case, as artists, we're making luxury collectibles, exciting, high-risk, high-yield investment opportunities for adventurous millionaires, for example, at the expense of destroying the environment, separating humans into a further deepened, distinctive hierarchies of class. So a statue, as in this Michael Asher artwork, was only as interesting as its context and its historical, economic, and social entanglements. An artist's job is to mold and sculpt these webs, and the material is only a means to make the work visible, to make these ideas visible. Sculpting actual material and making new sculpture is finished. So entering into that territory as a sculptor, I guess I wanted to position that complexity, because that really is sort of where I was starting from when I made this sculpture. I was at the Slade School of Fine Art studying for my master's degree, and essentially had a crisis. Like, I basically stopped making artwork for an extended period of time, to the point where my professors were concerned and suggested that I was going to fail my MFA. I got to this place because of these questions. I was like, how on earth do I here suddenly make sculpture? And the position that I arrived at was through thinking through this history and also looking at the world around me, as I just kind of discussed through this text. This sculpture was the first sculpture that I made after coming out of that process, I guess. And it literally started with a bucket of plaster, which was a material that was freely available at the school, along with clay. It was one of the few things that we were given for free. And I mixed a bucket of plaster, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I poured it on the floor. And once I poured it on the floor, it started to run away, as it would, because it's a liquid. And I found myself trying to keep it from running away, so I started to pull it towards itself. And through this process of just pushing and pulling this material back in towards itself, I started to make some kind of a mound that then formed into this like weird lump on the floor. And I realized that what had happened was that I'd had some kind of like a very one-on-one exchange with this object. I had somehow made it more vertical than it would be as a puddle. And it had somehow also remembered me by actually just holding the impressions of my fingers and my hands as I worked on it. And there was this little exchange of like being remembered by the material, and the material somehow gaining this other property that it never would have had without me, that became a place where I could actually start from as a sculptor. So this sculpture is called Pull Up, and in it I repeated that same process. I poured a bucket of plaster on the floor, But in this situation, I was naked, and I pulled the plaster towards me over and over and over again, until I basically created this tower. So I started, there's casts of my legs and my crotch basically, and then I can sit on top of the sculpture and leave these impressions and then keep moving upwards. So I was actually sitting on top of the sculpture as it was being made, resting against it, pushing against it. So it was actually suddenly the structure of the sculpture was taking my weight. By the end of the sculpture, as the very last cast at the top, you can kind of see my collarbones. I can't actually go any higher because of any kind of breathing or movement that I make, it'll break the plaster, excuse me. And at that point, when I'm casting that part of my body, I'm actually standing on the bottom sections of the sculpture, almost using it as a ladder. So it literally is as tall as it can go, and as high as it can go, using different body parts as what was the body part that most kind of like naturally I could rest against this form as it was climbing. So this is kind of where I started, and realized that I could have this more direct one-on-one relationship with the material. Oh, excuse me. How do I move forward here? By doing that. This has then kind of branched out. So that sculpture is from, I think the first edition, first version I made of it was 2006. So after that, I've kind of like used this technique to sort of branch out and kind of investigate some of the ideas of how we relate to the material world. So in a way, my solution to this material crisis that we're living through isn't necessarily to sort of dematerialize my art, but actually has been to try and establish a different relationship to material. Like, how can I actually have a different relationship to my materials as a sculptor, where I'm not just placing a dumb mass in front of me and then impressing my concept onto it, but actually having more of what I perceive as like a dance with the material. So in this situation, I'm building very simple, small cardboard boxes. These are shelves. They sort of hang on the wall. So that's why they look kind of floaty. Can you guys see the slide that's mostly on this side? Because for me, it's like the images of, yeah, you guys can see it all? Okay, cool. Because I've got like a strip of, like almost like a photo negative strip on the side. I'm not sure if you can see that or not. Okay, so basically, I started to do this thing where I mix pigments into each batch of plaster that I mix. So instead of you having what you had here previously, where you just see one continuous form and the breaks between each batch of plaster that I was mixing is more clearly formal, like you just see like the different shapes as the different layers. So I noticed that when I add color, I'm able to show each batch of plaster distinctly in a way where you actually see time a little bit more in the sculpture. So the color creates almost like this visual segmentation that is the temporal segmentation of the artwork. So each of these colors is actually a different batch of the material that was added one after the other. And that for me felt a little bit like a way to expand almost the time of the artwork by using color. So, and when you look closely, you can see impressions of my hands, and my hands are touching objects, like reaching for objects as if they were like objects on a shelf. So when you look underneath these sculptures, you can see, as here the two ones, you can kind of see there's a box in one of them. And then the other ones, there was like two cylindrical objects. So what I'm doing is I'm making these objects out of cardboard. They're very easy to then melt essentially with water and remove, as well as the sort of cardboard mold structure that makes the shelf. And they hang on the wall with steel embedded inside of them. So essentially these are kind of, for me, become sort of like impressions of desire. So sort of this desire for an object, this desire for something on a shelf, and this kind of reaching and grabbing relationship that we have to things that we made also in the world. So it's sort of like an impression of something that might be man-made or, you know, human-made, then being also desired and grabbed by human hands. This was the same exhibition. So as you can see, that white sculpture that I showed you earlier pull up, then with the color, how I hope you understand what I say, what I mean. I say like it expands the time of the artwork. It kind of like explodes the body in a different way. So I became a little more adventurous over time as to how I use the plaster against my body. So here I'm kind of like shifting into different positions that sort of relate to a contrapposto. And kind of exploring that traditional way of showing motion, but then also showing motion through this complete deconstruction of the body as well. So there's a lot of like repetition of body parts that wouldn't normally be in a figure. You know, for example, this figure has like 4 breasts, and then it's got several beginnings of arms, but they're incomplete. The legs are also multiplied repeatedly. And I really love how the plaster is able to like really pick up a lot of detail. And just, I feel like I should always say this, partly because like I'm putting plaster directly on my body. So plaster gets extremely hot, right? So it's extremely important never to encase yourself or any part of your body in plaster. You can burn a part of your body off, literally. So what I normally do is produce small batches, and then I apply them to one side or one portion of my body and wait for it to set enough that I can pull away. And then I'll go back and repeat that. So I'm kind of like moving up, literally from the ground up. These start with the feet, and I build the plaster up as a tower, kind of like I did with that first sculpture. So starting at the bottom and kind of like moving upwards. So the last parts that I'm casting are usually around my neck and torso. I started to exclude the arms mostly, partly because I want to kind of retain the notion that I'm making this object. This isn't an impression of this isn't an image of myself. Like this isn't a representational artwork as far as I'm concerned. This is indexical, right? So I don't know if it's clear the difference. Like in a representational artwork, I would be trying to represent a human figure. And in an indexical work, I'm kind of taking impressions of, or it's more of a one-to-one pointing at relationship that I'm having here. So this is my body, but it has become exploded and distorted through this process because I am an animate figure. Like, you know, I'm a woman who's moving around. I am actually moving around because I am making the sculpture. So the reason my arms can't be in it because I'm actually making it, and my head can't be in it because I need to see what I'm doing. So there's this very direct reason for it, but also I feel like that's a conceptually important aspect of the work. Okay, so I did a lot of stuff with plaster, got very excited, and I love plaster. And then I kind of wanted to go back into clay because it's a material that I feel has such a direct connection to the human form. It's, you know, tactilely speaking, weight-wise, it's the fact that, you know, it's such an amazingly common material and you can get it in massive volumes slowly and it never goes bad. So you can just add more water and you've got clay forever. So I've slowly accumulated a lot of clay. I used to work at an art supply store where I got a 25% discount, which was amazing. I highly recommend working at art supply stores if you're a recent graduate and need cheaper art materials. And so basically I was able to slowly accumulate almost 2 tons of clay in my studio. And that sounds like a lot, but 2 tons it's not that much really because clay is so dense, right? So it's almost like a meter cubed is about a ton. So I built a mold that was essentially a very large box that was 2 meters tall, more or less, and about, I would say, a meter by a meter. And I filled it with this clay that I had. And I wanted to understand like how much space I occupied in the world as a creature so that I could kind of like stand within it. So I basically dug a hole into that clay. And I started at the top. I sat on top of that pile of clay and I started to dig down. And it was an interesting process because I thought for some reason that I was going to dig like a dog. I was like, okay, so I'll just start digging and I'll go with my hands and then my head will just follow, right? And actually that's not how the human body works. So I realized that I needed to start digging, but also that I would sort of like lower myself, sit in a kind of seated position as I moved. And as I was doing that, I was creating all of these impressions on the surface of the work and realized that I could kind of cast these sculptures, sort of like cast these holes that I was leaving behind in clay. So this is a process of working that kind of like kicked off artworks that I then produced with clay. The molds that I started making were much bigger. So instead of that very linear box, I started to construct spaces that would allow me to capture different aspects of my movement. So instead of just digging straight down my height, this mold here was for an artwork that was at a sculpture park in Tilburg in the Netherlands. And so essentially I built a mold that is the diameter of my reach in every direction. And so reaching upwards and reaching sideways and down, kind of like Vitruvian Man. And so this is sort of my area of reach within this structure. And the interior was lined with this, I kind of came up with this technique for how to get clay to stick to vertical surfaces. And it's basically like small blocks of wood that have then what we call here chicken wire, like stapled all over it, and the clay really clings to the surface. So I was able to essentially line this entire box, the inside, with about 4 inches deep of clay. So again, like working with a lot of like this material in extreme volumes, I felt kind of like allowed me to have more of a one-on-one relationship with the material, where the material is kind of like capturing and remembering my movements. And I'm also sort of then having this relationship of like creating these forms that would never otherwise happen. This is kind of like how I've rationalized this weird stuff for me. So this is the access into that mold. I go through underneath, almost like a mechanic. I have a flashlight, there's fans blowing. There was also a hole at the top that blew air through to keep it fresh. And of course, using a mask. And so here's the inside of the mold. So I basically stood at the center of that structure and dragged my fingers on the wall in every direction. So I would lean out and reach as far as I could forward, and then drag my fingers all the way until my back. And I always faced in the same direction. And you can see here on what's my left side, I hope also your left side, there's a bit of a divot in this surface. It's not as smooth. And that's behind me. So as I moved my hands, what you start to realize is that the sort of geometric perfection that's projected onto the Vitruvian Man isn't really real, because your body is ventrally oriented. So all of your expansive, rounded, more symmetrical reach faces the front of your body, right? We think we are animals that have a front and a back. We're not like jellyfish, I guess. I don't know what they think, but like behind us, we've got that lack of ability to reach that creates almost like a invisible blind spot. Really similar actually to how you think of like the eye and the optical nerves. There's just like this spot where you have missing information. And I became really interested in that as I was, and kind of came to know that by doing this mold. So it was working through that way, and I knew it was there, but I kind of wanted to see it, So I produced this mold and ran my hands through all the clay, facing forwards, and was having this very, I don't know, it's a very, like being inside of a space that you've created that's completely lined with moist clay, and it's very dark, and you're sort of just quietly negotiating the space through touch. It kind of really heightens your tactility and your sense of touch, but also there's this kind of sense of almost like an interoception where you're sort of like really feeling the inside of your body in that space, and you're really feeling your volume and the way you move in a kind of like very kinesthetic sort of way, where I feel like it's a way of sculpting where touch is guiding much more than vision. And that became really interesting to me. So how to produce forms that are almost like, I'm not trying to, like, I don't know what this sculpture is going to look like really. Like, I'm not interested almost in how it looks. Like I'm much more interested in actually how it was made and the process of making it and the tactility that's implied in the process of making it. So it's kind of interesting to me that it's sort of, there is like a conceptual drive to making these sculptures. They're also like extremely performative in some ways. Like I get people a lot asking me like, oh, could you perform this sculpture? And I'm like, yeah, but you wouldn't see anything because I'm in a box. Like there's nothing to look at. Like it's, like it's really hard to convey that. Like it's a performance, but it's like completely private in a way. So it's sort of a funny like place. So this is inside the sculpture. So what I did was I lined the wall with clay. I gesticulated, I guess is a word I could use, like to, I sort of inserted my hands into the clay in all directions. And then I coated this with a material that's pretty common here in the US called aqua resin. So it's sort of a plaster that is mixed with an acrylic polymer that is sold as non-toxic, but I wear an organic vapor mask anyways. And it's especially in an enclosed environment where I was basically inside of a ball the size of my reach. So if you can imagine, it's a very closed environment. And I layered this material over the clay surface, producing a positive from the clay. So the clay is the negative and is the mold. It's essentially a push mold, right? What you think of as a push mold. I'm pushing into the clay and then I'm taking a cast from it. And so this was a mammoth rounded cast, and the inside here you can see, I mean, I'm almost embarrassed to show this because I would do this differently now, but like you can kind of see like me trying to make some kind of metal armature using threaded rod. Now I just use stainless, I've gone fancy, but this is just galvanized rod that I've kind of like hand bent into the shapes, and then was sort of using wire to kind of like start to tie them into loops, and then kind of like ended up putting rod there too, because this is not strong enough, obviously. But yeah, this is kind of me learning as I make. And you can see the inside with all the mixes of all the colors we were using. So I had a friend help me with this because it was so massive and I had to finish it in a month and a half. This is opening the mold. So you can start to see the sculpture. And this was for me the first time seeing the sculpture as well. I had decided to use a sort of round orangish terracotta color for it, kind of fruity. And so this is the sculpture as it was shown in the Netherlands, in Tilburg. So the exhibition was in a forest, and it's a Baroque forest, right? So if you can imagine, when you look from the sky down onto this forest, it's been bisected and cut into many paths that form these like perfect geometrical structures. So it's sort of the idea of doing this sculpture was very much a response to that Baroque dream of geometry being almost like a divine godly message, the perfection of like the golden mean and even the Vitruvian Man, and sort of like this notion that there's this divine symmetry imprinted onto things. So I was sort of interested in testing that a little bit and seeing what would happen. So you can see in the back this sort of like dip, or almost like a butt that becomes the area where I can't touch behind me. So it was really cool for me to actually like see this in real life, like what that area kind of looks like. Of course it would be different for everybody because like depends on your flexibility as well. But yeah, that's sort of the area behind my back where it kind of like the sculpture starts to come in. So this was in this forest for 6 months and then moved back to New York. So I thought I would go into like a couple of recent projects that, how are we doing for time? We're good, right? So like kind of recent projects that have been, I guess, me kind of like taking this work and taking these ways of thinking more out into the world and kind of starting to have relationships with things outside of myself. So, instead of works that are kind of almost like anthropometrically measuring myself or measuring my height or like taking direct impressions from me in a kind of way where I'm just more interested in my movement, like actually negotiating with more stuff. So almost like those shelves were negotiations with objects. So I did a biennial, which is actually like a monennial because the second one never happened, which was in Antarctica. And it was commissioned by a Russian artist that I met when I was doing a biennial in Russia. So he invited me to put together a proposal for this biennial in Antarctica. And I did, and I got accepted, and I went and I did the biennial in Antarctica. I'm not going to show that stuff because it's too much, but like the coolest thing that happened to me in Antarctica was that I sat down to have breakfast on this boat, and the person across from me, I was like, "Hi, what do you do?" And she's like, "I'm a space architect." And I was like, okay, like all architects work with space. I didn't really understand what she meant. And then she was like, no, I work for the European Space Agency. I build habitats that go into space. And I was like, holy fuck, like how cool. So she shared with me this project she was working on that's called She. And I think the coolest thing about Barbara is that I think she's extremely aware of her very rare and unique position as a woman in the field that she's in. I feel like it's, space tech engineering architecture for that world is an extremely masculine environment. So I love it that she made a habitat that's called She. And this is actually a European Space Agency built prototype that you see on the left. And it's in Spain, which is where they like use parts of desert Spain as like a fake Mars for stuff. And so this is like an astronaut walking around in this suit. And this, the other image is kind of one of the images that they proposed for these habitats, which is using it in places where there has been total devastation and total destruction of all infrastructure that we need for survival. So there's no way to get fresh water. The air might be toxified by things. You know, there could be like mold, whatever kind of like, you know, a lot of death, like, and it, you know, basically a very intense climactic and environmental crisis could have happened. So essentially that's what this habitat could be used for. It's called a self-deploying habitat. This is what the acronym is, SHE, self-deploying habitat for extreme environments. And the idea is that this can go to Mars, okay? So I was very interested in that. This habitat, as you can see, has these kind of like rounded flaps on the side. So those all compress inwards. They become flat, so it can be flat shipped. And the idea is that it can be put into, two of them can be put into a space capsule and then dropped somewhere like on Mars or whatever. And then they can self-deploy, so they'll open by themselves. And then when the actual astronauts arrived or cosmonauts, they can go in and have it as a habitat. So I basically built a model of this with all the stuff that's inside out of cardboard. So this is like that shelf, but like really big. And so I built this like a full scale basically model of the habitat in the back of a gallery that I had a show at here in New York, which is Arsenal, actually. This is the Arsenal show. So this model, which is what you're looking at from above, was built in the, I built it in the back of the gallery. And throughout the exhibition, I would come into the gallery when the gallery was closed. So really early in the morning, and I would work on this. And what I did was I basically destroyed the habitat from the back to the front. And I cast myself inside of these collapsed spaces. So when the habitat is closed, it's not designed to be occupied by human beings. It's kind of like in transportation. So my idea was like, as someone who has like some very, very serious concerns about what, as a Brazilian person, I see as a colonizing mentality with which this kind of space expansion of the human race is being perceived, and very, very concerned about what kind of people are leading this effort and what their drives are. I kind of wanted to make something that was critical of that. And so this for me is a way to sort of like, almost like I wanted to infect this environment, I guess is what I'm saying. So I see my presence in these spaces that aren't designed to be occupied by a human body when they're closed, right? So this structure expanded is designed to preserve and allow human beings to be in places where they shouldn't go. When it's enclosed, it's just designed to travel, right? So I was, by occupying this space before it was ready, like before it was done, with these kind of like gestures of trying to make myself comfortable inside of it. So I would sort of like sit on a shelf or kind of like recline and squish between things and try and find a place to rest my body. I started to sort of create these casts of my positions in relation to these objects that were in there, and then would take apart the objects. So what I was leaving behind was almost like this residual process of erosion, or like this residual almost like rust, or like a fungal growth or something that would signal some kind of decay, and leave behind these different forms. So from the beginning of the exhibition to the end, like what you had was the slow dissolution and destruction of that space. And then at the very, very end of the exhibition, this is all that was left. So these are all, you know, bodies that have my impression, therefore they are recognizably female. Because I'm recognizably female, naked. And then you would have the remaining sections of the architecture that was missing. So you had like everything that was a little space that I could get into and that I could rest on was somehow left as an impression. Everything else was gone. So it was sort of like this, and I really wanted this to kind of become a strange and alien and Martian landscape. Like I'm actually a huge fan of the science fiction story Solaris. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. It's by Stanislav Lem. And he really talks about like this notion of this planet and this misunderstanding and this kind of attempt at understanding a different planet and a different civilization that becomes sort of failed. And he uses sort of like this very beautiful descriptions of like dissolving forms. And so I was really thinking about that when I was making this as well. So here's another image. The other thing that Barbara showed me that I really loved, and then I'll show really briefly here, is that NASA actually does make anthropometric studies of human beings. So she saw that sculpture that I showed you guys earlier and was like, oh, like that's like a grass breach study, and told me to read this thing that's online for free that's called the Manned Systems Integration Standards Handbook. So it's basically the design handbook that NASA uses for, used in the past, not so much now, but like for designing interior spaces that go into space. So it's basically like, how small can a space be that you can stick a human being in without them going insane and with them still being able to work, right? Like that's literally it. So what you see these lines, these are grass reach, these are lines of an arm moving around. So these are like dimensions and measures of an arm, and they have, like 5th percentile outer boundary or 50th percentile. So these are like population, like, you're within the 50th percentile of the population or 90th, 95th percentile. So it's like the reach of a human being sitting on a chair. You can kind of see the profile of the chair in some of these images. One of them, you see the back of the chair, the lower images, and the other one you see the side. So this is a human body sitting on a chair because you're strapped into it because you're taking off, and you're having to access buttons that are on panels. So this is how they like design those panels to make sure that people can actually reach them while they're stuck to a chair. So I rebuilt that chair. I made that chair as a replica. And then this is my old studio, sorry, it's a mess. And this is the mold that I built. So it was like a small rounded version of that earlier mold where I could just do a right-handed grass breach. So I did that movement of taking up all the space I could with my hand in all directions. But this time there's a chair embedded in it. So this is the actual chair that I was sitting on, which then becomes embedded into the structure because I can kind of reach behind and I sort of surround the chair with my hand, right? So that's my right hand reaching as far as it could in all directions. And you see what are basically my fingertips. And this was in an exhibition, which I think the next slide is going to show you guys. Yeah, at the National Archeological Museum in Naples. So this is also like a way to kind of have a conversation with how we depict human beings and how we think of progress and civilization in general. So, this kind of maybe more romantic notion of, where a lot of the values about civilization and progress come for the foundation of countries like the United States and Canada, for example, thinking back to like Roman republics and Greece and democracies as models. And, these were, of course, slave owning societies where women were not allowed to vote. So there's a lot of these ideologies that kind of almost like contaminate maybe our highest values in some ways. And so it was sort of a way to have a conversation with that. I kind of wanted to also, let's see if I can do this. Go really, really quickly. I don't know if we have time into hang on. Let me stop share for a sec. Sorry, guys. And see if I can go to this other image. So we were just talking about 3D printing a minute ago. So I'll just go into this project that was also for the same exhibition really quickly, and just show you guys briefly. Okay, I'm gonna jump fast forward. Sorry, don't look, I'm making nauseous. This is the show in Naples. Okay, so this is where I wanted to get. So for the show in Naples, I had a prize, which basically a grant from the Pollock-Krasner Foundation, which was really awesome to get a kind of a grant that was directly from another artist in a way, even though they've gone. So Lee Krasner, after Jackson Pollock died, just set up this foundation. And one of the things they do, and you can actually apply from Canada, this is not just for US-based artists, is they give you a $30,000 grant that you can use in whatever way you like. So you can even apply and say, I have, I'm, whatever, like I'm a recent mother and I'm an artist and I can't make my work because I can't afford childcare. Like they'll actually help you out. So you can really apply for many reasons as an artist. I applied with a very specific project, which was the show at the National Archeological Museum in Naples. Because as an archaeological museum, they were like, we don't have money for your art. Like we'll happy to have you have a show here, but we don't have any money. And so I had to apply for grants. So this is how I was able to produce that show. And one of the things that I really wanted to do was very expensive, and this grant helped, is motion capture into a 3D printable sculpture. So I got my friend Meredith, who very kindly agreed to do this. And she's a dancer and also works with actors a lot in like more physical body work sort of, for performance. And we trained and learned 5 species-specific self-defense instinctive responses that human beings perform. So, you can think of it as like fight or flight, or you can think of also, you run away, you scream back, right? So that's almost like you're frightening back. You jump and scream and wave your arms. That's actually like an animal way of like almost like trying to scare back the person that's scaring you or the thing that's scaring you. You also kind of like sink, and that's actually begging for mercy. Like dogs do it when they kind of turn on their bellies. We do all of these things without thinking. And so we trained a lot of these, and then Meredith performed them in a motion capture studio. So hopefully this won't crash our internet. So that's one of the motions that we did. And then this is automatically turned into a 3D render. So basically, basically Meredith isn't the body that you see here, for the reason that if I was actually going to scan Meredith in, it would have cost so much money. This is basic female. You can download this shell, and that's how it's just basically the cheap way to put a female body onto a motion frame. So I was able to develop these images of her movement. So this is 1 second of movement, which is all I could afford to export from each of these 5 movements. And you can see like all of the different versions of Meredith here. And you can see some of the wire, I have such bad vocabulary for this, guys, I'm sorry. There's some stuff there going on. And so essentially we worked these files into a 3D printable sculpture. I got really excited about putting them in a box because I thought it would be an interesting way to kind of turn the video edit cut into a 3-dimensional visible line. So almost like a temporal barrier. And this is the process of like working out those cuts. So I'm technologically unable to do this by myself. Actually, I worked with a team here in Brooklyn called WOMP. They had a lab, a 3D printing lab here. And so it was really cool to work with Gabriela, who ran WOMP, and do this. And, then we had ideas about I really wanted the 3D printing to be visible. So the idea isn't to disguise the process, but actually have it be very much something that looks like a digital product. And we did PLA because that was what I could basically do with the time and money I had. But now I'm working to 3D print these in ceramic at a much smaller scale. So we ended up 3D printing them quite large. So one of them actually for the show. So I also like scooped out, I went in with Blender and kind of like scooped out some sections of the files because I wanted you to be able to sort of see into at least a little bit. You get this idea of like a body within a cloud of potential movement. So almost like this, superposition sort of state of like a cloud of possibilities. And then within it, you have sort of like a temporal snapshot of a part of the body. But it was very important to try and get it to still feel like one body as opposed to many. So that was like a lot of the work went into trying to conceive of how to show many bodies as one while still retaining the lines of movement. Oh, sorry, this is another thing. So let me see if I can show you images of the final printed sculpture. Oh, it's not here. But yeah, basically the final printed sculpture looked like that. So that's mostly it that I was going to show you guys. I think I can stop. And if anyone has any questions, I think maybe leave some time for that.
Oh, thank you for that really exciting presentation. So many beautiful, beautiful pieces, Juliana. Really congratulations on such a fabulous practice. I imagine there will be lots of questions. I see already that Sean has raised his hand, so maybe I'll pass over to Sean.
Yeah, just to start, thank you. That was an amazing talk and amazing.
Thank you.
Really interesting. I have a question actually that goes back to your, I think, second or first slide. There was the kind of joke around bacon, the two bacons. But I did wonder if you showed the first bacon. I mean, I can obviously see a connection to your work, and a kind of, in my mind, almost a flip of what he was pursuing. So do you have any thoughts about that you want to share? Or?
Ah, that's interesting. I mean, to be honest, like I'm not that deeply familiar with Bacon. I mean, I know his work and I'm a huge fan, but I'm not super familiar with his thinking about his work. So maybe you can tell me just a little bit more about that, and I can.
Well, where I'm going with this, and maybe I'm projecting my own baggage here, but you know, I see those as kind of very anxious works, and about our bodies and a state of disappearing and merging with the world, but a lot about anxiety, right?
Yeah, I think of Bacon as a very like angst kind of, as like the main affect in his work for me is like this. There's this like modern angst. Yeah.
Whereas in your work, it's almost the opposite. There's a kind of celebration of us interacting and our bodies breaking down. A necessary response to the challenges you brought up at the beginning. So yeah, that's the flip I saw. That makes sense.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think in some ways, I mean, like even in the presence of like Catholic, you know, Pope looking images and figures in Bacon's work, like I think there's definitely this conversation with almost like a repression and an oppression. I mean, living in England and being queer, and like I think there was his experience, I think, was probably, and his work was very informed by almost this oppression of the body, right? So it's almost like disintegrating and deforming, partly because I think of society's outward to inward pressure. At least that's how I feel them. But and in my work, it is interesting actually now that you brought it up, because I'm definitely inside pushing back out. So there's this sort of inversion. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Like I mean, there is very much this sort of assertion of trying to make a space that happens with working in this way, and working from the inside out for me is like a very important element of almost showing forms that are like they are inhabited. There are in a way a distortion of the human figure, but a distortion that is also a revelation of these kinds of more extreme outward capacities of the body, right? So it's sort of like this potential. It could do this, it could be this, and distorting the shape by redefining it by activity for me is very interesting, you know? So like, what are these activities that we do, and why do we like reduce the body to its bare minimal survivable outline, right? So like my skin, if you go through, then that hurts, right? So it's just like, what about if I move that border out and actually push that out to my capacity for like self-determination and you know, ability to discover, achieve, and do, and so those borders are actually further out than my body, right? So it's like this conversation of, again, going back to like the tactile, the kinesthetic, like moving those borders out. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Thanks again. Terrific work. Yeah.
Sorry, I see Selene, you have a question next?
I do. Juliana, your work is so beautiful.
Thank you.
And I love your, I love it. I just love it. It's fantastic. I wanted to ask, I have stalked your website before, but you have these pieces that you're calling urns that are on top of these sort of terrarium type structures.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about those a little bit? Like, why juxtapose these human forms on top of these little enclosed environments?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can try and pull up an image of one of these artworks so that we can look at them, and so it's a little less abstract for people who haven't seen them. Basically, I started making these when I was doing I started a project in Brazil. My uncle actually he went to the army to pay for college essentially, and then started working a lot in the north of Brazil as a means to because he works in security, like he works security. So essentially he started working a lot in the north of Brazil and met these ceramicists that were producing these like very commercial, almost like imitations of like what's basically Brazilian Amerindian, like I later found out, funerary urns. So these are not, they're kind of like, basically like sold as pretty domestic objects, but they are actually inspired by really ancient, going back almost 4,000 years in what was not Brazil then, in the Amazon region, this production of funerary urns that were body-sized. So people were actually buried in extremely incredible, beautiful ceramic vessels that depict transformation and transmutation of the body into animals or into other forms. And they're sort of a beautiful thing to me, because they're kind of like making objects as machines. So they're like ceramics, but they have a mechanical function. They're designed to actually transform the body. They're designed to almost like take the process of losing your body and substituting it or facilitating the body becoming something else, right? So it's almost like a butterfly sort of like shell, that you can then emerge from. So I was just blown away by when I started researching these objects that my uncle would bring back when I was a child. Like I researched this recently, right? As an adult, I was like, what on earth, and why don't I know about these objects? I'm a sculptor and I'm in Brazil, and like, how the hell what is wrong with people? Like, why don't these objects get shown and talked about? They're in such an incredible history of Brazil. And so I started to research them, and also to, very, very aware of the modernist appropriation of like native, not only African, but also like American indigenous ceramics, artifacts, artistic production. And became kind of like, how could I, because I was already doing this in a weird way, like by making my body inside clay. I was like, how can I have a negotiation with that? And sort of, I did this exhibition where I made some of these urns when I was doing the research for that show that you saw with the space habitat that was destroyed. There were some there. They were kind of like when I was studying. And then this is the show in Brazil, what you see here. So this is actually in the exhibition I did in Brazil. I included the indigenous funerary urns from 4 different nations. Some of these nations no longer exist. They were destroyed by colonization entirely, and worked with a museum to actually bring replicas into this show. So there was like the original, like replicas of the originals were all over the show. And then I had made some kind of like conversations with these objects as well. And I wanted to put, like, it really bugs me that we have white boxes as galleries. Like, I find it really almost like castrating and neutralizing of everything. It's sort of almost like this beautiful product sales room for art. And I wanted to bring something out from the outside in, and without sort of like pouring mud everywhere on the floor, which would have been an option, I guess. I was like, I want to make something that can always go with the artwork. And so I complicated this artwork a lot by creating a terrarium. So every time this artwork gets shown, this terrarium needs to be remade. And it's, to me, very satisfying that like the people who show the artwork have to cultivate a living thing as well, to go underneath this thing that is in a way talking about the loss of the body. And then the plants and sort of sculpting of the terrarium have a direct relationship to some of the regions where a lot of these funerary urns are actually excavated from. So these are like plants that were indigenous to some low-lying areas of the Amazon basin where like these artifacts were excavated from, almost like suggesting that this would be the correct place for something like this, as opposed to this white box gallery. So kind of trying to complicate a little bit of that relationship. So this is something that can always be with the work, as opposed to sort of like having the works in an installation. It kind of allows them to sort of travel a little more compactly, I guess. So yeah, that's kind of where these have come from.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for talking about that.
Thank you.
We're coming up to almost 3 o'clock, so can we have maybe a couple more questions? Is that okay, Juliana?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, great. But maybe we'll just wait. If anybody else has a question, they can either put it in the chat or raise their hand. I'm going to ask you, because I know that you've always like really worked hard to make opportunities, to have collaborations, to have exhibitions, to build community. And we have lots of students here who are going to be graduating soon. I was wondering, could you share a little bit of that? Like how you work as an artist, not only to make the work, but to make a community and show work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's many ways. I'm very, like, I think really as an artist, it's great to curate as well. Like if you can organize exhibitions, especially when you graduate, you know, as a way to sort of maintain and support each other, sort of like organizing your own exhibitions, applying for things, applying for spaces in order to be able to produce exhibitions with each other and make work. And I think also, so that's something that I started to do like quite naturally after I graduated. Also kind of organizing studio critiques and visits. So with other artists, as a means to kind of like continue this sort of active mental exchange that you are able to have when you're in grad school, I think has been really rewarding. These groups tend to dissolve because it's like someone gets busy, someone does this, someone moves, but it's sort of always, you know, they kind of like always still come back together in some way or another. So there's a few groups that I have here that in New York that have been like instrumental in kind of helping with just negotiate and check in with friends about work and have studio visits. And I think also I have two collaborators essentially that I work regularly with. So I have Zoe Claire Miller, who lives in Berlin. And we met in Moscow actually when we were both in the biennial. And we kind of have this parallel practice world together where we explore very specifically like how to show female sexuality in a different way. So, and when I say female sexuality, like I guess, you know, like Zoe is queer and I'm a very open-minded person. So like, I think we kind of have this way in which we sort of don't necessarily want borders, like, you know, this is not a trans exclusive way of talking about female, like we are super open in terms of how, like, but I guess this is where it becomes an interesting point. It's like, what exactly are we talking about when we say like female? Like what exactly are we talking about when we say femininity? So in a way, it's kind of a tactile and visual way to explore those things. So we, you know, sometimes think of like moisture and like gloopy forms, or we'll think about, you know, installations with plants that specifically have like very powerful effects on the female biology, like, you know, for example, plants that might give you an abortion if you eat them at the wrong time of your life or of your pregnancy, but in other moments if you eat them, like they'll help you with your digestion, or, you know, like there's all these different chemical reactions that I think are interesting that we've explored. So I have that kind of more expanded practice with another artist, and then have another artist here in New York that I work with who's a dancer and sculptor called Georgia B. Smith. And like we have this performance project that we are developing and have been developing together for like 2 years now. And I think it's wonderful to sort of get out of your own world as an artist and kind of like collaborate with others and really trouble make it problematic, the notion of like, who's the author of this piece, you know? Like when Zoe and I work together, we're like, we're a third person. Like, I don't know who made this artwork. Like, I wouldn't do it if it was just me, and she wouldn't have done it if it was just her. It's this other person appears when we work together. And I think that's a wonderful place to explore, where it's, you know, I feel more adventurous and a little more risk taking, like when I'm working with other artists. And I think that's a very fun thing to do, and a way to build community for sure.
Thank you. Do you have any last questions? Okay, I'm going to be selfish. I'll squeeze one more in then. It's kind of mind-blowing to think what it must be like inside one of your forms, like when you were doing the Reach piece. Mm-hmm. Can you reflect on that? Like mentally, do you have to be like create a very, very strong situation for yourself, or does it dissolve away in the process of making?
Yeah, it feels very like, it's funny, like it's like when you wrap yourself in a lot of blankets and you've done it yourself, like it feels very safe. So I feel actually very safe inside of my sculptures, and like it's quite quiet. In fact, because I'm wearing a mask and because it's a very echoey kind of, normally these forms become very rounded and kind of echoey, I sort of become very, very conscious of my heartbeat and very, very conscious of my breathing and hearing those sounds. Like that's basically it. Because the clay kind of deadens, because it's very thick, it kind of deadens a lot of other sounds from the outside. So it becomes very, very, it's very meditative and like very slow working. And because I can't, it's often tight spaces, or, you know, if I'm working with a wider space, like I can't see exactly what's happening behind me. I'm working more by the sense of touch to see like what's missing and what needs to be added, or like where I'm kind of like perhaps like needing to carve out more space or things like that. So it's really like a relationship that's very, very tactile, especially if I'm moving my body through a material and realizing where I don't and do have space for myself. So I like it. I have to say, like, it's really nice. But it's also, it is also like, for example, I work with an engineer who is a volunteer, like he helps me as a volunteer, you know, like he's a retired engineer, and basically I met him because I used to work at the Pollock Art Museum here as a videographer, and his wife works there, and she was like, he's an engineer, because I think they were worried about me. So like they helped me build the structures, the mold structures, in terms of like knowing what the dimensions of lumber I should be using, because some of these mold weigh, you know, like some of the ones I've built more recently that are really big, like can weigh like 3 or 4 tons, and they're raised off the ground, and I'm getting in through the bottom. So it starts to get pretty dangerous. And I need engineering advice. So yeah, but it's definitely an experience that then informs the work, you know, in the fact that like things like interoception and being more aware of your own body's functionings are now feeding into drawings, for example, for me.
Wow. Thank you again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we'd love to have you come to Edmonton. We'll try and make that happen somehow. You see, you've got the sculpture class in the bottom there.
Yeah, cool.
You can see the sculpture studio there.
Nice. Awesome. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
So you say the next show is in California?
Yeah, California is in June, or no, July actually. And then I'm doing I'm working on a sculpture commission now for a building here in New York. It's not that big, but yeah. And then I'm also I have a solo show in September in New York. That's where that's like the main